Silas Croft swung the heavy transit onto his shoulder, the cold brass biting through his wool coat, and squinted down the valley. It was the autumn of 1878, in a high cirque of the Colorado Rockies, and the air was already sharp with the promise of a brutal winter. Below him, perhaps a mile distant, he could hear the faint rhythmic thud of an axe. It was Henderson, the newest arrival, racing the calendar to get his cabin roofed before the first heavy snow. Silas watched the small figure moving beside a pile of fresh-peeled, bone-white logs. The cabin was going up in the flat of the valley, right where the aspens gave way to a wide, gentle, alluvial fan. It was a beautiful spot. It was also, Silas knew, a killing field. He shifted his gaze upward, above the Henderson claim, to the massive, bowl-shaped basin that fed the fan. He didn't need the transit to see the trim line on the opposite ridge, a stark, unnatural boundary where mature spruce had been sheared off halfway up their trunks, as if by a giant razor. Below that line, only stunted, flexible willow and alder grew. The mountain was telling a story, but men like Henderson were too busy, too focused on the flat ground and the easy access to water to read the scars. Silas Croft was not a trapper by trade, though he ran a modest line. He was a surveyor, a man who had spent the last 20 years reading the language of elevation, gradient, and geology for the railroads. He understood what a 40-degree slope meant when it was loaded with 12 feet of snow. He understood that the beautiful open fan was not a gift from the mountain. It was the run-out zone. It was the place the mountain shed its skin. The sound of the axe stopped, and a thin curl of blue smoke rose from Henderson's temporary camp. Silas felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the wind. He had warned Henderson, or tried to. "That's avalanche country," Silas had said, pointing to the cirque. Henderson had just laughed, clapping Silas on the shoulder. "It's a mountain, Croft. It's all avalanche country. Besides, look at this ground, flat as a prairie. We'll be sheltered fine." He had pointed to the low moraine, the ridge of glacial debris that defined the fan. To Henderson it was a wall. To Silas it was a ramp. Silas turned from the scene, his boots crunching on the early frost that stiffened the high-altitude tundra. He was building too, but his sight was a mockery to the others. He was hauling his logs up the mountain, not down. He was building on a narrow, wind-scoured spine of granite, nearly 500 feet above the valley floor, exposed to every gale. His own current shelter was a miserable pit house dug into the lee of a boulder, damp and dark. But it was temporary. He was waiting. He was planning. He had chosen his spot, not for its convenience, but for its defiance. He had seen what convenience cost. He still carried the memory of the winter of '77, a winter that had taught him that a standard cabin, built the standard way, was just a box waiting to be crushed or buried. That winter he had learned that snow was not a blanket. It was a slow-moving river, and when it decided to run, it took everything with it. The winter of 1877 had been Silas's brutal education. He had built his first cabin in the Rockies just like everyone else, following the wisdom of the plains and the eastern forests. He'd found a sheltered spot in a lower valley, tucked against a gentle slope, shielded from the prevailing wind. He built a standard 14 by 16 box, saddle-notched, with a shallow pitched roof. It was a good, tight cabin. It was also nearly his coffin. The snows began in November and did not stop. By mid-January, the world was white and silent. The cabin was buried. The snow was not just on the roof, it was around the walls, level with the eaves. He had to dig a tunnel upward from his door just to get out. But the real terror came in February. A warm snap, a Chinook, had settled in for 2 days, followed by a sudden deep freeze and 3 feet of new powder. The snowpack became a layered, unstable thing. He was inside, stoking his small stove, when he felt the pressure change. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a deep vibration through the soles of his boots, a subterranean groan. Then came the creak. The massive ridge log above his head, a 12-inch spruce trunk, began to make sounds like a ship tearing itself apart. The uphill wall of his cabin, the one built against the sheltering slope, was taking the slow, agonizing pressure of the entire snowfield. The snow was settling, compacting, and moving. It wasn't a catastrophic avalanche. It was a glide, a creeping mass of thousands of tons. He spent 3 days and nights listening to his home die. The chinking powdered and fell from between the logs. A gap opened above the doorframe. The uphill wall began to bow inward, the logs visibly curving under the immense silent load. He couldn't leave. The snow outside was a 30-foot deep trap. He could only sit, axe in hand, staring at the wall, waiting for it to collapse and entomb him. He felt the cold, not as a draft, but as a presence, the cold of the snowpack itself leaching the heat from his fire, the temperature inside the cabin hovering just above freezing. He burned through his wood supply at a terrifying rate. He survived, the slide never fully released, but when the melt finally came in April and the cabin emerged, it was ruined. The structure was permanently warped, the uphill wall pushed in by nearly a foot. The foundation was shattered. He had built a strong cabin, but he had built it in the wrong place, and he had built it with the wrong shape. He realized the fundamental flaw. Everyone built to fight the wind and the cold. They built square walls and shallow roofs. They saw snow as a weight to be held up. They did not see it as a liquid. They did not see it as a force. That spring he abandoned the ruined cabin, taking only his tools and his transit. He would not build again until he understood the mountain's rules. He spent that summer and autumn not as a builder, but as a student. He climbed the high ridges, his transit on his back. He was not surveying for a railroad, he was surveying for his life. He sat for hours, watching the way the wind sculpted the snow on the permanent snowfields, carving cornices and loading the lee slopes. He climbed down into the paths of old avalanches, studying the debris. He saw how the white death flowed. It moved like water, but with the density of rock. It sought the path of least resistance, but most importantly, he observed what survived. He noted the cleavers, massive vertical blades of granite that jutted from the ridges. In the run-out zones, the debris was scoured clean. But in the shadow cast by these cleavers, often for hundreds of feet downstream, pockets of old-growth trees stood untouched. The slide split around them. It was a lesson in fluid dynamics taught by granite and spruce. He found his second mentor in the valley of the Uncompahgre. He came across an encampment of Ute and watched an old man, whose name he never learned, building a wickiup. The structure was temporary, but its placement was not. The old man had built it on a slight rise behind a low wedge of rock. Silas, through a mix of sign language and broken Spanish, asked why he built there, exposed to the wind. The Ute elder looked at Silas as if he were a child. He picked up a handful of sand and fine gravel and let it pour from his hand onto a sloped piece of bark. He held a small stone in the path. The sand flowed, parted around the stone, and left a protected cone of shadow behind it. He pointed to the stone, then to the massive granite ridges above them. He made a sweeping, flowing gesture with his hand. "Snow," he said. Then he pointed to the protected space behind the stone. "Home." The lesson was absolute. You did not fight the mountain. You did not build to stop the force. You built where the force could not go. You used the mountain's own strength against itself. Silas knew then what he had to do. He would not build in the valley. He would build on the ridge, and he would build his cabin like a stone. He returned to the high cirque in late summer, his gaze bypassing the inviting, deadly valley floor. He spent 2 weeks searching, climbing, using his transit to measure the slopes above. He finally found his location. It was a narrow, exposed spur of granite that jutted out from the main ridge, 500 feet above the valley. It was buffeted by the wind, and it would be a hellish place to haul logs. But 20 feet upslope from the spot was a massive, 40-foot-tall cleaver of gneiss, a natural deflector blade rooted in the core of the mountain. This was the place. The spot was in the cleaver's snow shadow. For the next month he did nothing but plan. He sat by his fire, sketching on scraps of canvas and the backs of old assay maps. The problem, a standard cabin even here, would present a flat wall. If the avalanche was big enough, if it jumped the cleaver, it would still hit the cabin. The solution? The cabin itself must be a cleaver. He would not build a box. He would build a wedge. The uphill-facing side of his cabin, the one that faced the mountain, would not be a single wall. It would be 2 walls, meeting at a sharp, heavily reinforced apex, like the prow of a ship. This prow would be pointed directly at the cleaver, creating a secondary, smaller deflector. Any snow that spilled over the main ridge would be split again, flowing harmlessly around the structure. The roof would be a single steep pitch, a shed roof, slanting downhill. Snow could not load it. It would slide right off the back. The walls would be the thickest Engelmann spruce he could find, logs no less than 14 inches at the tip. And most importantly, the foundation would not be stone. The foundation would be the mountain itself. He would anchor the cabin to the bedrock, pinning the sill logs with iron rods he'd packed in. The structure would not sit on the mountain. It would be part of it. His neighbors, Henderson and the others, watched him. They saw him struggling to haul massive logs up the slope with the block and tackle. "You're building in the wind's eye, Croft," Henderson yelled up one day, shaking his head. "You'll be blown clear to Kansas." Silas just wiped the sweat from his brow, his hands raw from the rope. "Better the wind," he muttered to himself, "than the slide." He picked up his broadaxe, its heavy, single-beveled head gleaming. He had to shape the prow logs. They had to fit perfectly. The labor was brutal. It was a one-man war against gravity and time. Getting the logs to the site was the first battle. He felled the trees far below, skidded them to the base of the spur, then used his mule, ropes, and a capstan to winch them one by one up the rocky incline. Each log took half a day. Then came the foundation. He didn't level a patch of ground. He scribed the massive 18-inch sill logs to the natural uneven contour of the granite spur. He spent 4 days with a hand drill and a 3-pound hammer, driving holes into the rock, setting the iron pins. When the sills were set, they were immovable. The real test of his skill was the prow. A standard saddle-notch corner would never hold. He needed a joint that would lock the 2 bow walls together and withstand a massive shear force. He chose a complex, interlocking dovetail notch for the apex. He spent a full week with his broadaxe and slicks, shaping the massive diamond-shaped corner post. It was a masterpiece of joinery, a single piece of spruce that would be the cabin's cutwater. He swung the broadaxe with a steady, powerful rhythm, the blade slicing off great sheets of white wood, the thunking echoing in the thin air. He shaped each log of the V-prow to fit with obsessive precision. There could be no flat faces for the snow to catch. It had to be smooth. It had to be strong. The side walls went up faster. He chinked not with mud and grass, which would freeze and crack, but with oakum, tarred hemp fibers he'd hauled from the railroad, pounded tight between the logs. The roof was a marvel of practicality. He laid heavy log purlins, covered them with thick planks, and then layered sheets of pine bark, followed by a foot-thick layer of sod and tundra mats. The weight was immense, anchoring the structure, and the sod would insulate. But the steep, 45-degree pitch meant the first heavy snow would slide right off the back, which overhung a sheer drop. He built the door on the downhill side, protected from the prow. He allowed himself one small, 12-inch square window, south-facing, with a 2-inch thick internal shutter. The fireplace was a massive construction of dry stacked stone on the downhill wall, its chimney a stable, protected column. By late October, as the Hendersons were nailing the last shakes to their roof, Silas moved into his fortress. It was small, barely 10 by 12, dark, and felt more like a bunker than a home. But as he sat inside and listened to the first winter gale shriek against the prow, the cabin didn't shudder. It hissed. The wind was splitting around it just as he'd planned. The winter of 1879 began with a fury that dwarfed the previous year. Storm after storm rolled in, burying the Rockies in catastrophic amounts of snow. By late February, the high country was a white desert, silent and primed. Silas had not seen the Hendersons' cabin smoke for a month. They were buried, existing in a white tomb, tunneling for air and wood. Silas, on his wind-scoured ridge, was exposed, but he was not buried. The wind stripped the snow from his roof and swept it into the valley below. But the basins above him were filling. He knew it was coming. He could feel the tension in the air. The silence was too heavy. On the third night of March, a warm, wet wind blew in from the southwest. Rain. It was raining on 20 feet of snow. This was the trigger. Silas sat on his stool, the fire in his hearth burning low. He was not sleeping. He was listening. His hand rested on the massive dovetailed king post of the prow. He could feel the mountain groaning through the wood. Just after midnight, the rain stopped. The temperature plummeted. A new gale hit from the north, dumping 2 feet of dry powder on top of the saturated heavy slab. Then came the sound. It was not a sound he heard with his ears. It was a boom that he felt in his chest, a deep, seismic crack, as a cornice the size of a city block let go from the summit ridge. The mountain was shedding its skin. He had seconds. He braced himself against the prow wall, extinguishing his lantern. The sound grew from a rumble to a deafening, solid roar. The sound of 1,000,000 trees snapping, of granite boulders being ground together. It was the sound of the world ending. Then it hit. The cabin was struck not by a wave, but by a thing. It was a solid, grinding impact that drove the air from his lungs. The cabin shuddered to its foundation pins. The sound was indescribable, a shrieking, scraping, grinding noise that seemed to come from all directions. It was the sound of the slide splitting on the granite cleaver upstream and then striking his own wooden prow. Dust and powdered chinking exploded into the air. The timbers of the apex screamed, a high-pitched shriek of wood fiber being tested to its absolute limit. He felt the entire structure flex, twist, and groan, the iron pins in the granite holding it against the torrent. He could hear massive blocks of ice and rock striking the prow, glancing off the angled logs. The noise lasted for 30 seconds, though it felt like a lifetime. It was not a hit, it was a flow. The cabin was an island in the middle of a river of death, and then, as quickly as it began, it was over. The roar receded down the valley, replaced by a terrible, ringing silence. He was breathing hard in the darkness, his knuckles white where he gripped the post. The air was thick with pulverized rock dust. He was alive. The cabin had held. He did not leave the cabin for 2 days. The storm continued to rage, and he knew the slopes were unstable. He sat, listening to the wind, examining his home. The prow had held. The dovetail joint at the apex was undisturbed. The logs were scarred, gouged, and polished by the impact, but not a single one had cracked or shifted. The structure was sound. On the 3rd day, the sun rose into a clear, cobalt-blue sky. The world was pristine, white, and silent. Silas unbarred his door and stepped out. The sight stopped him cold. The snow, which had been 20 feet deep, had been carved away by the slide. His cabin stood on its granite plinth, but the north-facing prow was scoured clean, the wood raw and splintered, packed with a frozen slurry of ice and shattered trees. The avalanche had passed by on both sides, close enough to touch. He walked to the edge of his spur and looked down. The valley was gone. Where the Hendersons' cabin had been, where the beautiful aspen grove stood, there was nothing. The alluvial fan was a wasteland of tumbling ice blocks, mud and splintered timber, scoured clean down to the frozen earth. The moraine that Henderson had trusted for shelter had been breached and erased. There was no smoke. There was no sign of life. There was only the massive, dirty tongue of the slide, stretching for miles down the canyon. He was the only man left on their edge. The news of the 79 avalanche and of the lone survivor traveled slowly, moving with the spring melt. When miners and new settlers pushed back into the high valleys, they found the ruins of the lower settlements, and they found Silas Croft living on his fortress-like spur. They called his cabin Croft's Prow, or the Ark. At first, they thought him mad or impossibly lucky, but the evidence was written on the landscape. The valley floor was a graveyard. His cabin was a home. The dissemination of his idea was not immediate. No one copied his design exactly. The labor was too great, the joinery too complex for the average settler. But the principles were absorbed into the vernacular of the high Rockies. The lesson was learned. Men stopped building on the flat, open fans. They began to build like Silas. They tucked their cabins high on the slopes, in the shadow of granite cleavers and massive rock outcrops. They stopped building square to the mountain and began orienting their structures to shed the snow. They built steeper roofs. In the new mining camps that sprang up, engineers began building massive splitters, stone and log V-shapes upstream of the mine entrances and stamp mills, diverting the slides that threatened their operations. They were, whether they knew it or not, copying Silas Croft's prow. His cabin outlived him by decades, becoming a landmark, a shelter for lost trappers, and finally a legend. The families that settled the valley in the 20th century owed their lives to the lesson he had learned, a lesson that had become so ingrained they no longer knew its origin. They just knew. You don't build in the run-out. What Silas Croft had understood intuitively, modern engineering would later validate with complex equations. His design had succeeded based on three principles. The first and most important was terrain shielding. He had recognized the protective power of the granite cleaver, placing his cabin in its lee shadow, where the primary force of the avalanche would be blunted and deflected before it ever reached him. He had used the mountain's own geography as his primary defense. The second principle was structural deflection. His V-shaped prow was a perfect example of applied fluid dynamics. The cabin did not attempt to stop the avalanche, which would have been impossible. It parted it. By presenting a sharp, angled prow to the flow, he minimized the impact surface and converted the catastrophic blunt force trauma into a glancing shear force, steering the tons of snow and debris around the walls. He had built a ship to sail a sea of snow. The third principle was structural anchoring. By pinning the sill logs directly to the bedrock, he ensured the cabin could not be pushed off its foundation. It was not a separate object on the mountain. It was an integrated part of the mountain. It achieved a state of permanence that the Henderson's cabin, sitting lightly on a loose stone foundation, could never have. Today, the most advanced avalanche defense systems in the world, from the Alps to the Andes, use these same concepts. Massive concrete wedges and earthen deflecting dams are built to steer slides away from villages and highways, operating on the exact principles Silas Croft worked out with a broadax, a transit, and a profound, fearful respect for the power of the high country. Silas lived in the cabin for another 30 years. He watched the valley below him slowly recover, new aspens growing up through the old debris. He saw new cabins built, this time higher up, nestled in the lee of ridges, their roofs pitched steeply. He was known as a quiet, watchful man, the man who had survived the White Death. His cabin became a part of him. The logs of the prow, scoured and polished by that one night, were smooth to the touch, a constant reminder. The broadaxe hung on the wall, its edge sharp, a symbol of the precision that had saved him. He reflected in his later years that the Hendersons had not been foolish. They were just wrong. They had brought the rules of a gentle world to a place that did not know them. They had seen the valley as a resource to be used, a flat place for a home. Silas had seen it as a power to be respected, a living thing with habits and rules. He had not built his cabin to conquer the mountain. He had built it to listen to it. Survival, he realized, was not about strength or defiance. It was not about imposing your will on the landscape. It was about seeing the world with clear eyes, understanding its true nature, and then finding the one quiet, safe place to stand. The mountain always has the final say, but it will tell you its secrets if you are humble enough to observe and wise enough to adapt.